We have love for Africa. There is hope, hope in Africa. We are serving Africa. We are serving Africa. With all passion, we are serving Africa.
Welcome to Serving Africa, where we are looking at the various challenges facing Africa and what is being done to solve these issues, to improve the living conditions of millions of people living in Africa. With me today here at the MTA International Studios in London are two eminent personalities, the Director of Programs for Humanity First and one of the project managers at Humanity First. Africa, a continent rich in resources, human minerals, as well as arable land, yet plagued with poverty and hunger. Millions of people in Africa, especially in the rural areas, are not able to produce enough to feed themselves and their families. For those who are able to produce enough, they are being exploited in the open market.
Whenever we think of Africa, we unfortunately think of poverty. 388 million people live in conditions of extreme poverty, and it is estimated that 1 in 3 people living in sub-Saharan Africa are undernourished. The problem that farmers face is that they lack the resources needed to grow, process, store, transport, and ultimately sell their crops. This puts them in a position to be exploited. Instead of growing staple foods that will feed them and their communities and earn them a living, they grow only some crops to eat. They are forced to sell the rest of their raw crop at low prices in markets and to companies for them to be used in products such as coffee and chocolate. It has even been found that cocoa growers in Africa receive only 6% of the price of the chocolate bar paid by the consumer, with many farmers earning less than $1 a day. This is a clear example of the conditions farmers are faced with. All of this creates a cycle of poverty that many African farmers cannot escape from, with these problems being passed on generation to generation.
Fazal Ahmed, you are the Director of Programs for Humanity First, and you've been going to Africa quite often. Could you tell us what the main issues are in Africa?
I think the main issues, there are resource issues, but actually for me, the main issue starts from ambition. So there are farmers who, because they've traditionally lived a subsistence lifestyle, I grow only this much because that's what we need for my family. That's all they do. And generation after generation, that's what they do. Whereas they have the potential in their land, they have the potential with their environment, sometimes to have 2 seasons and to grow significantly more volumes, but they don't know how to reach a market.
Mr. Issa Wema, you are a project manager at Humanity First. We've seen some of the issues. What do you have to say about what is the major cause of this food insecurity?
Well, I think to start with, we have difficulty with the seasons. We talk about climate change. In fact, if you want to know about climate change, you go to Africa. But when we were growing up, we knew when the rains were coming exactly, and farmers were able to program themselves to grow and harvest. Now, towards the end of the year, no rains have fallen. Now, when Fazal Saab said, Mr. Fazal here said about people growing just a little, it is because of that. By the time the rains come, it's so late, they cannot grow more than enough because there's no time. So all they can do is just grow a little bit, which they can feed their families with if they get the crop at all. So that is the main reason, one of the main reasons, in fact.
Are there other reasons, Fazal Saab?
Yeah, as I said, it starts with the ambition. So we've done numerous projects where we're assisting farming communities. You look at Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone has 80% arable land, and yet 10% of it is being farmed, only 10%. If you go north of McCaney, you've got swathes of land and you've got huge youth unemployment. And we've been talking about training up the youth to be able to farm so they can become an exporter again, but it's not happening. And it's because there isn't necessarily that drive yet and that understanding of the global market dynamics, that if they overproduce, there is a market for those crops. They still think that this is how much we need, therefore that's how much we grow.
Is it not also possible that lack of certain infrastructure may be the cause of this food insecurity in Africa?
Well, when you talk about infrastructure, can you specify? Because there's
roads, how to store the product, the produce and stuff.
Yeah, storage is a very big problem, because at the moment when you go to certain places, when they harvest, when you are there during the harvest period, you see so much waste. As they bring the crops from the farms, they can eat only a little bit. The rest is just wasted. The reason is that there is no storage facility. I know in certain places what they would do. For example, let's mention say tomato crop. When they harvest the tomatoes, when they take all those pans of tomatoes to the market, by the end of the day, it isn't bought. They bring it back home. By then, it is full of water. It's getting soggy. What are they going to do with it? They haven't got the refrigeration to store the tomatoes for the next market day. So what happens? It's just poured away, because the next day they will go to a farm again to go and harvest the fresh crop. So storage facility is a very big problem.
Storage, a very huge area of concern. Now let's look at exploitation. Are people, farmers in Africa, being exploited? And if so, why?
I think it's a strong term to use, exploitation, because many farming communities, it's within their control. They often have their own lands, and they are able to freely grow crops. But when we talk about resources, we're not talking about, combine harvesters or heavy equipment. Even simple things that in some areas, if you don't have fencing, then you might be growing crops, but the animals are coming in and grazing and your crop's gone. If you don't have drip irrigation technology, and drip irrigation technology is hugely expensive, then with limited supplies of water, you can only cultivate certain parts of your land, whereas there are technologies out there that allow you to take a limited water supply and irrigate a much wider area. So these are the types of challenges they face that, given the resources and the opportunity, they're perfectly capable of doing a lot more.
Just to add to that, but I agree with what Father Saba said to a point. What you talked about exploitation in the beginning. There is internal exploitation as well. You mentioned how they exploit the coffee growers and so on and so forth, external markets. Internally also there are exploiters.
What do you mean by internal exploiters?
For example, within the country itself, you have those who normally come and buy these crops on a wholesale basis and then go and retail. What do they do in terms of the tomato farmer? They will wait until the sun is coming down. They don't want to pay the proper price. But the
farmer becomes desperate,
yeah, and so gives it to them at a giveaway price. And they take these to the cities and sell them for far more than the retailer could even think of. So there is the exploitation within the country itself.
What is Humanity First doing to help alleviate this sort of situation and to help improve the living conditions of these farmers? Faisal.
So I suppose you could talk about, and Isa could talk about some stage of the process. We start off with the growing phase, where we're assisting farmers, the storing phase, where we have certain approaches that we've taken that have been helpful, and then the processing phase to turn those raw crops into higher value products. In terms of growing, in many parts of Africa, we're providing them with tools, seeds, fertilizer, fencing, sometimes irrigation, access to tractors, so that they can cultivate their land. And we're also looking at relationships with universities to train people in how to increase crop yields. You see, that knowledge of how to take that piece of land and grow this much crop rather than that much was always there. Traditionally, it was always there. When modern methods came in, they assumed that with fertilizer, with this form of irrigation, with this new crop, suddenly let's forget all of our traditions. Yeah. Let's forget all of our traditions.
So are you saying we should now go back to basics?
Yes. Look at Burkina Faso. So where the Sahara Desert starts, the Sahel area, this is Burkina, Niger, Mali, all of that area, where the desert is encroaching, it's encroaching year on year on year. You talked about climate change. We're seeing that. We're seeing the water table dropping. We're seeing the desert growing. Now, they tried so many ways to stop the desert. In the end, one clever spark in Burkina Faso, this is north of Wayugia, he said, well, there was a traditional method called Zay. This is a traditional method of West Africa where they dig trenches, they use charcoal, they use manure, and they by putting these layers in, not only do they stop the desert coming, they're reversing it and building forests where the desert was. This is a tradition that's been there for hundreds of years in Africa.
So is Humanity First also encouraging such practices in your activities?
I mean, this particular example won an award in the UN, and that farmer was taken to New York and given an award. So of course, where we see practices like that, we promote it. Desert Fridge is another example from Nigeria. Do you want to talk about?
Well, Desert Fridge is, like you mentioned, was designed by one of our Humanity First staff, and it was shown to, in fact, it started in Nigeria, didn't it?
Yeah, it was a
and
teacher.
And then we took it around the other African countries.
So it was an innovation, or it's an innovation within Humanity First?
Combined with this teacher that you mentioned, this teacher, he wasn't working with Humanity First then, but he found that he could use this kind of fridge just with clay to create something which can store vegetables and fruits for a week or two.
Well, we'll have a look at that later. We would have a look at the Desert Fridge itself, and you could take us through what it does and how you do it.
Yes, and also I would like to mention another form of storage, which is just using air, just the way the air is made to rotate within the building, the way it flows within the building. We mentioned Burkina Faso. This again comes from Burkina Faso, where it can be stored for a long time.
Well, viewers, it's getting interesting. We will be looking at how Humanity First, through their innovative Desert Fridge, is being used to store products. Now, let's take a look at the Desert Fridge. Could you tell us what this Desert Fridge is and what the components, how it works? It seems quite heavy.
Well, this is a very little one compared to what we actually have on the field. But it is a concept of two pots, one within the other. And in between the pots, there is sand. And this sand is now moistened. They put water through it, and that cools the products which are inside the second pot.
So we put products
inside this pot.
Here?
Yeah. But in between the two pots, there's sand.
Yeah, I can see some sand there.
With water, and that is the cooling system.
So you would water it twice a day.
So you put water around here?
Yeah, you pour water in here,
the sand.
Okay.
and it's the evaporation that makes the inside cooler.
Okay, so do you dig a hole and put this in, or you put it on the floor in your house?
Put it on the floor, wherever you want to put it. And in fact, like I said, they are much bigger than this, so they store a lot of stuff like tomatoes, vegetables, anything that you want to put in.
This is quite heavy. How do they manage to carry it?
Well, just as they carry the big pots that they've been storing water in from time immemorial, they've always done it. You look at it here as a heavy thing. You don't put the sand in and carry with you. Okay. You just take the 2 pots, the equipment itself. Okay. When you get to where you are going to store it, there you put the sand, because there's sand everywhere. You put the sand and then put in your water.
You see in places like Brikama in Gambia or Korhogo in the north of Ivory Coast, you'll find that they put this in the corner of a room and they put it there and they leave it there. And this becomes like a domestic, this is not an industrial scale system, this is a domestic one. They'll put peppers, tomatoes, cucumbers, various
Lettuce
other... Yeah, exactly. Those kinds of fruits and vegetables they store in there, and it's perfectly sound.
So
in some parts of Africa, let me just add, they did this much earlier, but they didn't have this concept of 2 in 1. What they did was they had a big pot, but sitting on another small, if you like, a pan with sand in that pot, with water in it. They put a big pot on it and always put water in the sand. Okay. And that is what cooled the water for drinking. Okay. It is the kind of water you'll enjoy drinking throughout the day.
So what would you say has been the impact of introducing Humanity First, introducing the Desert Fridge? How many have you deployed so far?
So what we were doing is in countries like Ivory Coast, Senegal, Gambia, first of all, we trained pot makers in how to make the concept. Yeah. We went to villages, village after village. We started in Brikama, went further east in Gambia, along into the Central River region. We trained farmers in how this could help them to store crops, and then we left them to it. We said to the pot makers, you make the pots, you earn your income, farmers will buy it. We've created a market for you.
Brilliant. Helping pot makers make the right pots for the right purposes, and also synchronizing it with farmers. Now let's take a look at what's happening on the ground.
My name is Traore Mustafa. I really want to thank Humanity First, who offered a cassava machine to our village. It was a relief for everyone here, because before we had the machine, our mothers and women were suffering, having to transport the cassava to a neighboring village where they would have to grind the cassava by hand, which was a very difficult task. Now, with the arrival of this cassava machine, the women save money and do not have to work as hard. Even transportation is cheaper. And not only that, we also produce a lot more cassava and work more efficiently. So we thank Humanity First for this gift, which has done a lot of good.
Je me présente, je suis M. Alassane Dambélé, fils de ce village.
My name is Alassane Dembele, and I would like to say thank you for the donation of the cassava machine to our mothers. Before we had the machine, our mothers were suffering a lot, so the arrival of this machine was a great relief for them, all the other women, and us men. And since our mums do so much for us, the machine is very much welcomed. Before, our mothers were having to peel everything by hand and use traditional tools. So once again, with the machine here, it has really been a relief. So I would like to thank Humanity First.
My name is Janet. I am in Ase. My job is to make cassava. Before, we had to do it all by hand because we had no machine. But Humanity First gave us a cassava machine to work with. It gives us courage and strength and has made everything easier and less expensive. So I say thank you to Humanity First for all they have done for us.
So Faisal Ahmed, Director of Programs for Humanity First, could you take us through what you do in terms of helping the rural farmers with the processing of their produce?
So what we're finding is that there are many products like rice and cassava and maize where the raw crop does not attract the value in the market until it's been processed. So we have various machines that we're deploying. Typically these are machines petrol driven, imported from places like China. For cassava, for example, we deploy a machine shared between 3 or 4 villages in Ivory Coast, for example, and they would come with their bags of cassava. They would put the cassava into the big hopper. They would pour palm oil on there. It grinds it into a paste that they then use as a foodstuff. They mix it with fish or vegetables, and that's something which, when they take it to market, it has much greater value. In the same way, we're doing rice hulling in Uganda, we're doing maize in the northern parts of the Sahel areas. We've even done couscous milling in Gambia, and all of this allows it saves the women the time, because it's the women who do the hard work with the processing, and B, it's suddenly turn a raw product into something of much greater value in the market.
What would you say has been the significant impact Humanity First has made through training farmers on how to process their products, the maize, cassava?
It's not so much the training. They already know how to, we don't need to train them. But deploying these plants, in Ivory Coast alone, we've deployed 23 of these processing plants. There are 50,000 people using those. That's 50,000 people who expend much less of their time and energy processing the crop. And because it's largely the women, A, they're earning more income for it, and B, with the time that's saved, they can spend that on their children, on education. And it's a cumulative effect that's taking villages out of poverty.
So what Humanity First has done is to help them do this mechanically. They used to do all this manually. And that is why it took so much time, like Father Sahab was talking about. But now with the machinery, the grinding equipment that they've been given, it makes it easier and faster. So they save a lot of time.
I understand there is a call from one of your team members, Yankoba Sinayoko from Gambia. Yankoba.
Yes, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon you. How are you, sir?
Yeah, I'm fine, sir. Yeah.
Could you tell us what you do in Humanity First in the Gambia?
Humanity, I'm program director of operations and then director of Feed a Village program in the Gambia.
So, Yankoba Sinayoko, pardon me for the pronunciation of your name, Director of Programs in the Gambia. What does that mean? What has Humanity First been doing on the grounds to help alleviate food insecurity issues in the Gambia?
Humanity First, since its creation, has been engaged in the disaster relief and trying to see the type of production, working with the rural poor population in the Gambia, and then try to eliminate poverty, hunger, and malnutrition. And what we try to do, we try to raise productivity and income to improve the quality of their life. This is what we are doing by the production of every kind of crop. We give them seeds, machineries, fertilizer, and then they're able to produce crops for their families.
In your own estimation, Mr. Yankoba, would you say your activities are having impact on the people in the Gambia? And to what extent?
Yes, it's having a very big impact on the people. Recently, last week ago, we have some documentary on that. The Minister of Agriculture visited some of our farms in the Gambia. And then we are one of the only NGOs who are going directly to the poorest people in the rural community to help them. We target the rural poor to help them to improve their lives. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. But in your opinion, your last remarks, what do you think could be done to improve the situation, the food insecurity situation in the Gambia through Humanity First, the way forward?
The way forward is trying to create more awareness, education. With that, we are doing very much knowledge for life, and we are doing that. And then the agricultural product made by more machinery, creating horticultural gardens. Sometimes we have realized that there is a shortage of rain, so that has created a lot of problems. Humanity First have come with strategies trying to create horticultural gardens for villages, which now most of them is able to help them to overcome the poverty, and then they are able to produce a lot of vegetables, and they are using it, selling it also, and then their life has been improved. The many communities in the Gambia now are enjoying horticultural gardens donated by the Gambia Humanity First, and the government and the ministry are all happy about that program.
Thank you so much for the good work you are doing, sir, in the Gambia. We just spoke to Yankoba Sinayoko, who is the program's manager director in the Gambia for Humanity First. We just heard Yankoba telling us about the good things happening on the ground. You were talking about exploitation. What do you have to say about exploitation, and how is Humanity First helping to deal with that?
We've spoken about the growing, the storing and the processing of crops, but we're also lobbying. So, for example, to really move Africa to a new place, we need to bring more of the supply chain into Africa itself. I'll give you an example. If you look around the Mount Elgon area of Kenya and Uganda, they grow Arabica coffee beans on the mountainside. Now they've got a coffee processing plant in Budadiri. It means they can take the beans and actually turn them into the second stage of coffee themselves locally. And this means that the farmers can get much more of the income themselves without the beans having to go abroad. If we can do the same for cashew nuts, if we can do the same for cocoa and chocolate and so on and so forth, the more of that processing which is done locally in Africa, the more the value that the local communities will get from their crops.
I think to add to that, even when that happens, the governments must still make sure that they are vigilant. Because in some countries, when they want loans from the IMF and so on, they give them directives to stop the local factories because of a loan. Now, if anybody wants to enhance the living standard of your people, they don't tell you to stop them from having an income from one area and then you start from somewhere else getting a loan. They should be able to enhance that, not to stop it.
Thank you very much, Isa Wema. But to finish off for us today, Fazal Ahmed, what would you say has been the overall impact of Humanity First on the people of Africa with regards to food security?
I mean, a combination of our programs, we're reaching at least 250,000 people every year now. And, you know, it's not just the physical work that we're doing. Word travels from village to village. You've seen that. When we did the first cassava plant in Ivory Coast in Assé, this is near Boisseau on the border with Ghana, suddenly word went out to surrounding villages, and then we started to get demand from Yamoussoukro, we started to get demand from Man, we started to get demand from Ferkesedugu in the north. And this is how. Once the experience, once the knowledge is there, automatically villagers, they don't have to wait for an NGO, they can club together themselves, get the money and buy their own machinery. That's the future.
Well, this is all time will permit us. This is 7 Africa. With me to discuss this program has been the Director of Programs, Fazal Ahmed, Humanity First, and one of the project managers, Isa Wema. Thank you for joining us. And until the next segment, goodbye.
We have love for Africa. There is hope in Africa. We are serving Africa. We are serving Africa. with all passion we are serving Africa.